From WXCI 91.7 in Danbury, this is Public Reading Club, a radio program dedicated to discussions about books, writing, reading with writers and book people. Your host is Matt Caputo.
Thanks for joining us on Public Reading Club. Our guest today is Chris Belden. He's the author of the novels Shriver and Carry On, the story collection The Floating Lady of Lake Tawaba, which won the Fairfield New Rivers Book Prize. In the fall of 2003, with Woodhull Press, he published Closer to Freedom, Prose and Poetry from Maximum Security, a collection of writings by members of Chris's prison creative writing workshop. I believe he was at Gardner Corrections in Newtown for several years before the pandemic. It was really fantastic to talk to him. I really kind of dove into his work. I read his novel Shriver, which is now a movie called Little White Lies, starring Michael Shannon, Kate Hudson, and Don Johnson. But I was really compelled to bring him on to talk about this project where he collected the work of incarcerated writers. He just has a lot of stories about how these writers and these pieces of work came to be, and we had a great conversation with him. So stay tuned for this great chat with Chris Belden, who he also hosts an open mic in South Norwalk. It's called FUMFA, a Poets and Writers Live, and there's some info about that online. It's FUMFA, Poets and Writers Live. That might be Fairfield U MFA, but I don't know that's the truth. Right now, you can get the book on Amazon, anywhere books are sold, and you can actually watch A Little White Lie, which is based off Chris's book Shriver, on Hulu and Amazon and all those other good places. So we really hope you enjoy our chat with Chris. He's really fantastic guy, a lot of insight into not only writing, but teaching writing in a correctional setting. And I know some people in the WestCon MFA program are interested in teaching and sometimes teaching in those institutional settings. So enjoy, and we'll see you again on Public Reading Club. We have a very special guest today on Public Reading Club here at WXCI 91.7, streaming online at WXCI.org. Here on the campus of Western Connecticut State University. It is the newest episode, and with us today is a very special guest. The power of Instagram helped bring myself and Mr. Chris Belden. He is the editor of a book called Closer to Freedom, Poetry and Prose from Maximum Security. And it's written by largely incarcerated writers, all incarcerated writers.
Yes, about 60 plus incarcerated writers.
And it's there's poems, essays, and other stories on love, racism, redemption, criminal justice system, the ever elusive meaning of time, as I'm reading the back of the book here. Chris, before we get into this book, which I think is really important, I myself am very interested in issues around incarceration, and I've taken a real interest recently in people who are still incarcerated for cannabis. It's been a real big interest of mine. A lot of my reading is dedicated to that right now. And I wanted to bring you in because it seems like you had such a mission to create this book and to get these voices out there to the public. Why don't you, before we get into all that though, why don't you start, just tell us where you're from and what was the beginning of your career? How did you get involved in writing, even at your earliest ages?
I'm from the Midwest, Canton, Ohio, which is northeast Ohio, not far from Cleveland.
Home of the Football Hall of Fame.
The Pro Football Hall of Fame.
That's right.
Which I visited many times as a youngster.
Wow.
And ended up in New York for a while. I was a musician, writer, doing a lot of different kinds of stuff. And eventually really kind of settled into the writing gig, and ended up in Connecticut about 20 years on from there. But all along I was in workshops myself, writing workshops, around the city, and started working as a workshop leader through a group called Writers Corps, and we did work in the Bronx where we were going out there and working with underrepresented people, people who normally don't get the chance to have a writing workshop. I worked specifically with senior citizens, and that was a mind-blowing experience.
Wow.
Just to work with people who never written before, and I really caught the bug. I wanted to do more of that. I started working with New York Writers Coalition, which does that kind of work too. Worked in a soup kitchen and a couple other places, and then moving up here, I've always wanted. I don't know why. I can't tell you why. I have theories, but I had some flea in my ear about working in a prison.
Wow.
Maybe it was just because talking about underrepresented people who don't get an opportunity to do this kind of thing. I mean, of anybody I could think of, it's people who are incarcerated,
wow,
who don't get that chance. So, I got that opportunity and jumped at it.
Were you a writer that went the college route yourself, or you more of a self-taught type of writer?
I studied undergrad, University of Michigan.
Wow.
I studied film though.
Wow.
And then, over many years in the city, especially took writing workshops to work on my writing, and did eventually get my MFA at Fairfield University. And that's where this project started. We, one of the requirements was to do a so-called non-creative project, which meant it wasn't related.
We call it the enrichment project here.
Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
and this is my enrichment project.
Is it? Yeah. See, I like that name. I like the enrichment project.
Enrichment project.
Yeah. It sounds much more meaningful. And most people were doing, I don't know, they were writing basically like book reports.
Right.
Dialogue in the novels of Charles Dickens or whatever. But I wanted to get out there and do something. And this is what I chose to do. And somehow I got into Garner Correctional over in Newtown, maximum security prison, men's prison, and I was able to start this workshop.
Do you think it had anything to do? Was a prerequisite for teaching? Was that an MFA or anything like that?
It was an MFA, yes, and I did have my eye on teaching, at the college level. Which once I graduated, I did that some, adjunct work.
Mm-hmm.
It's a grind.
Yeah.
So I don't do that anymore. I'm open to it, but I'm not as interested as I was. Surprisingly, I ended up doing this for 10 years. Well beyond the point, beyond my graduation from the MFA. It was so meaningful to me and gratifying. And as long as I would say, as long as they're going to let me into the prison, I'll keep going.
Wow.
And then of course COVID happened, so they didn't let people into the prison.
Right. Yeah, that became a thing.
Yeah.
So what? Your early work as a writer, what kind of stuff were you into? Were you more of a creative fiction writer?
Yeah,
doing
fiction.
Journalism?
No, pretty exclusively fiction. And I have a few novels out there in the world. One was recently made into a film.
Wow.
Came out earlier this year. The film is called A Little White Lie. I think it's on Hulu now.
Yeah.
But the book was called Shriver. I'm not very happy with the title change. But I am happy with the movie. The movie turned out okay. And some really good people in it. And so, I've been out there writing novels, stories, getting that stuff out there. But, nothing has been as gratifying as this project.
No, I have to tell you, though, you could probably be on a whole other episode about the Shriver thing, because we've had, I don't know if you've seen, we've had a number of, I guess you'd say crime novelists, right? We had Peter Blauner and Reed Farrell Coleman and Lawrence Block. They were all on the show previously.
Great.
So it'd be one day interesting to pick your brain about the roots of your novel. There is that, and the little reading that I did do on you before I invited you in here today is that's like a detective novel, right? A bit of a
No, I do have a detective novel. That's called The Private Dick. And that's Kindle only at this point.
Okay.
But people can read that out there. Shriver's a whole other thing. Shriver's an imposter syndrome novel. I mean, there's a mystery element to it, but it's really about imposter syndrome.
That's really interesting, and we could pick that up again at some point. But tell me about, you have this Closer to Freedom here, and it's mind-blowing because it's a very thick book, but it's probably not even this is a tiny fragment of the stories that could be told and the voices that come out of the incarceration system. Tell me how we got to this. Where's the idea for this bound book here start?
When I started working in the prison, that was in late 2009. I didn't know how long it was going to last. It's like if the prison is so unpredictable for many, many reasons, not just for the people who are incarcerated, but for for people going in, volunteers like I was. They could shut it down any minute. Mm-hmm. There were a couple times where I thought maybe they were gonna. Yeah. So
no, that's a familiar story that you just said. Is that when we had our MFA residency here at WestCon a year ago, earlier in 2023, actually, at the beginning, that was the kind of shared consensus among the panel of speakers who had taught in the prison system. They said that it almost seemed like they could shut this program down.
Oh yeah,
any second.
It was at the whim of the administration. Fortunately, for a lot of that time, we had a warden there who was very receptive, and he could see that it was actually helpful.
Right.
Because these guys come in. First of all, it's self-selective. They're there because they want to be there. And so they tend not to be, troublemakers or whatever. They want to learn. They want to try something new. But, having this opportunity to express themselves this way and to meet every week and be vulnerable. Prison, as you can imagine, is not an environment where vulnerability is encouraged or even a good idea.
Right.
For, 99.9% of the time. So, I had a policy. It was like, what happens in this room stays in this room kind of a thing. And once you build that trust, they would come in.
How?
And be that, they would open up and then, then they would leave and go to their cells and have the rest of their days. And they would be, generally speaking, more mellow,
How many of the students that you had in the correctional facility were on the remedial levels of literacy?
I couldn't give you a percentage, but I would say it was low percentage. I mean, there were always going to be a couple of guys who had a hard time reading and writing, but it was generally guys who were really interested in books. We started in the library. Eventually, the librarian retired, and they closed the library.
Wow.
Yeah, and we got together and reopened the library ourselves so that they would have access to books. I mean, they had access to books, but very, very limited without the library. But so these guys were like library regulars, basically. So they were pretty literate. I mean, they would read all different kinds of stuff. Some guys had written books.
Really?
Yeah. And then there were guys who struggled a little bit, but they still had a story. They still had a voice.
Probably compelled by movies and books, and some
sure
books themselves.
Movies and hip hop.
Yeah,
hip hop's huge influence.
Yeah, huh?
Huge.
Were some of them trying to write hip hop in the class?
Yeah, I mean, basically
verses and whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of performance poetry going on, which had a really hip hop element to it. I mean, it was. You could almost hear. We had no access to to any kind of musical accompaniment, but you could hear it.
Yeah.
And they you could tell some of them hoped, maybe when they got out or whatever, they could get into that.
There's something, I think it's called the Prison Journalism Project. Have you heard of that? There's a lot of
there's so many projects that it's hard to keep track. Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting stuff coming out of that.
Yeah.
A lot of creative nonfiction and also kind of articles that these guys are sharing. The writers in here, were they all really met here? And where did they all come from? Just here in Newtown? That they were all at that one facility?
They were, yeah. The whole time, the 10 years that I did this, it was all at the one facility. So that's where they were. But of course, they came from all over.
The material, it's a federal prison, right?
It's a state prison.
Oh, it's a state prison.
But there were guys originally from out of state, but there were a lot of guys, Connecticut born.
The material, so it spans a 10-year.
Yeah.
Type of and how did you collect this stuff? Like, how was this on paper?
Going back to where you said how did this book come about? Kind of lost that thread. A couple of years in, I decided that two things. One, that I would give them an opportunity to read their work aloud to an audience other than the group itself, and we would invite people in. From the outside and people from the inside, and they would have an audience and they would read. It was really important for them as writers. I think it's hugely important to have that audience and to see the impact that you have on them. The other thing I wanted to do was collect their work and publish it. And so over those 10 years, I published myself with some financial help from GoFundIt or crowdfunding.
Right.
Sources, and also from Westport Writers Workshop, where I run workshops. They pitched in money to create these chapbooks, basically, collections of their work. So I would collect their work, type it up. This was grueling.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of work.
Because some guys would give me a lot of stuff, and sometimes the handwriting wasn't so hot. But I would type it up, give them copies, their original copies, typewritten copies, because they liked having, they could show it to people. It's all typed up. And then I kept it for these little annual chapbooks. Mm-hmm. And then, when COVID hit, all of a sudden I wasn't going into the prison, but I had all this material, and some material that I hadn't been able to put in the chapbook. And, I was like, I miss these guys. I miss the work. Wouldn't it be cool to just put it all together in one big book? So, I had tons of materials, like, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of pages of poetry and prose, and went through and selected what I liked. And then I had to get permission, because this was going to actually be published by a publisher. It wasn't like a little in-house thing. I had to track everybody down that I could and have them sign off on it. Some guys wouldn't sign off, which was a bummer, because there was some work that I really wanted in there, and that took a while, but that's how it ended up in this one big volume.
The guys who didn't sign off on it, did they give you a reason why?
Some guys just never responded, so no reason. One guy wanted money. And I wrote back and I said, listen, nobody's making money. I'm not making any money on this.
Right.
And in fact, the publishers, whatever money they make, which is probably not going to be anything, because, it takes a lot of money just to put the thing together for them. If there's any money, they're going to give it to Community Partners in Action, which is an organization in Connecticut that helps people after they're incarcerated.
Reacclimate and whatnot.
Yeah, with work and housing and food and all support, that kind of support. So nobody's making a dime on this thing, but some people they want their dough.
How many of these incarcerated writers? How many of them were channeling or writing about a traumatic experience in their life?
I don't know. It happened.
Yeah.
I didn't encourage that. I didn't discourage it. It was like, I'm not a psychologist.
Right.
I didn't want to re-traumatize people. Okay, write about the worst thing that's ever happened to you, because there was some bad stuff that happened to people, and some of that would come out just naturally. I always gave them prompts. Often it was some poem or some piece of prose that I would give them, and from a craft level, it's like, okay, do what this guy's doing, or I would give them a topic, and then they would come back, and they were very determined to stick to surprisingly for me, to stick to the assignment. They didn't mind being told what to do at all. It really surprised me, but stuff would come up, and I mean, one story is the story's in here, big guy, muscle-bound biker dude guy, tattooed, and very intense. Turned out to be like a very mellow guy. He'd been in for 25 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
He was into yoga, meditation. He was very level-headed. He wrote a story about an encounter with his father, who was an alcoholic, when this guy Pat Walsh was a little kid, like 5 or 10 years old, his father tore up his teddy bear, threw it in the garbage, and he finds it in the garbage. The kid does.
Wow.
And then he runs and hides because he hears his dad come home because his dad's going to beat him up. He stood in front of this group of people, and I hadn't been there that long, and he said, I don't know if I can read this. It was so raw and so vulnerable. This is a tough guy,
Yeah.
And he read this thing, and with tears in people's eyes, and everybody patted him on the back, said that was so great, and it was great, So, things like that would come up in stories, but I didn't want to encourage it because that would turn some guys off.
You're in a state prison. There's probably a lot of different crimes in there that these people committed or were alleged to commit. How many of them were trying to document freedom? How many of them felt like they were falsely accused?
Not that many.
Really?
Not that many. Most of them were like, yeah, I did it, and I'm sorry I did it. I'm a changed person.
Yeah.
I've learned. A lot of them.
Were there lifers in there? Or?
Oh, yeah. Serious lifers. And there was one guy, Marquise Jackson, who's in there. He was exonerated.
Wow.
So, but interestingly, he never said to me personally, I didn't do it. He was just like, he kept his head down. And he'd been in there long enough, and he had his legal team, and he was just working on it. And 19 years, he came out.
Wow.
Totally exonerated. So, that's a happy ending, but that's 19 years of his youth.
Yeah. How many of them were in jail for narcotics?
I would guess quite a few. One of the rules really going in, not a rule that's written anywhere, but if you're going in, I read a lot of stuff by folks who've done this kind of work, and the one thing that they always say is don't ask.
Mm-hmm.
Don't ask what they're in for. It might come up, and it would occasionally. Might come out in the writing, might come out in conversation, and occasionally it would. There's still a lot of guys I don't know what they did.
Wow.
But there were definitely a lot of guys who were into dealing drugs, who were addicted to drugs, and often they would commit other crimes.
Right.
There was bank robbery and stealing cars and what have you, because they needed the dough.
Wow.
To feed their habit or whatever. But drugs were involved one way or another in probably, I don't know, the majority. I mean, even guys who were in for murder. It's because they were messed up.
Yeah.
Very sad.
And did you basically stop because COVID had interrupted your teaching there?
Yeah, COVID came down, and that was it. And there was no going in, and it was years before they started letting people in. And at that point, I was like, okay, I've kind of done that.
Yeah.
For 10 years, it'd be hard to go back in. Not because of I miss the guys. Many of whom had been released over that,
through COVID.
During the COVID thing or shortly thereafter, and so it'll be a whole different crew, which is okay, and I miss them, but I didn't miss the process of dealing with the administration and that whole thing. That was always the toughest part of the gig.
So when did you actually start putting the book together?
It was probably a year and a half ago, more or less. Took a little while. Well, it was probably longer ago. It was a year and a half ago that the Woodhall Press said, "Okay, we're going to do this."
Mm-hmm.
So and I had to come to them with a product, So at least probably a couple years ago, where I just started cobbling it together to see what it would look like, and getting an idea of what I had.
Are you in touch with many of the people that since they've been released, or?
I have. We had a reading in Newtown a couple weeks ago, and 5 guys came out.
Wow.
To read their work and answer questions. And in fact, there's another one at the Norwalk Library, November 19th, Sunday, November 19th, 2 p.m., Norwalk Library. Be there. At least a couple guys have kind of come to that. So yeah, there were guys I was in touch with anyway, even before COVID and what have you. Marquise, the guy who was exonerated, I would talk to him. A couple other guys. But since the book came out, I've been in touch one way or another with everybody, inside and outside. And, it was great to see them. Most of these guys I've never seen not wearing their tans, the prison outfits.
And I love how they wrote their biographies here at the end.
Yeah. That was really important to me, that they get the opportunity to tell something about themselves. Some guys didn't, for whatever reason, they didn't want to do it, or they just forgot or something. But
how have any of these guys, even on the early levels, have they pursued any writing outside of prison?
We talked about that a couple weeks ago because people were curious about that at this reading. And they all say, yeah. One guy, JV, he's made several short films, and he's written a lot of screenplays.
Really?
And he's done that kind of writing, and he also wrote a novel, and he's written some kids stuff. So he's pursued that quite a bit. The other guys, they talk about it. I hope they do. They talk about writing about their experiences, especially, memoir type things. It's hard. It's hard to be out in the real world. I mean, their lives are very complicated as, people who have been released. They're dealing with a lot of stuff. And, the thing about having this workshop was like every week. It's like, okay, every week you're coming, you need some pages.
I love the language contained here, which is like really authentic language. Just reading this one gentleman, I hope it's okay reading this one gentleman's biography here. A lifelong Connecticut resident, Kenneth Anderson was born in 1963. He graduated from Central High School in 1981 and went on to Clinton to study technology. In 1982, he joined the U.S. Navy and was accepted into the CT State Police Academy in 1989. Yeah. However, unforeseen circumstances did not allow Kenneth to continue. He caught his first felony case and was headed on a downward spiral of crime. He ultimately robbed 3 banks in South Carolina, where he was sentenced to 15 years. Released in 1998, he later reoffended in Connecticut and was sentenced to 10 years. He was released in 2015. While on the inside of Gardner Correctional Institution, he took Chris Belden's creative writing class as well as applied theater with Gardner librarian Mark Aldrich. Mr. Anderson continues working in theater and writing and has become effective in his church, where he has recently appointed the position of elder. He has obtained his operation engineer card and currently works as a crane operator.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds like a very, very interesting life.
Yes.
This individual had.
He's a great guy, Ken. He's older. He's a wise fellow, and he's one of those like really solid guys. It's like, there's a lot of guys in there you meet, and you're like, okay, I understand, more or less why they're here. He was one of those guys like, why is he here?
Wow.
Because by the time I met him, he had his head on very straight, and he's done really well. He's an amazing actor too.
Really?
He's just a complete natural, and he's one of the guys who will be at that reading in Norwalk too.
Would you want to read his work here?
Yeah, sure.
This is Kenneth Anderson's work from Closer to Freedom, edited by Chris Belden.
Dear Mr. Warden, my name is Kanani, and I am 5, but I'm going to be 6 next year when I go to the kindergarten school and the bus brings me. I was thinking, is my Papa Kenny over there? because I need my hair cut for school. I saw him on the TV. Do you have his helicopter plane over there? He said he was going to take me and Kenora to the beach and fly his helicopter plane. You like roller coasters? Papa Kenny made me laugh. Grandma said she's going to let me talk to Papa Kenny when he calls from his truck. Did you ride in Papa Kenny's big truck? OMG, it's bigger than a spaceship. But I have to go now. Tell my Papa Kenny to come home now because I need my hair cut for school next year. Oh, and tell him don't forget to bring his helicopter plane. So that's in the voice of his grandchild who didn't know he was in prison, you know. It's like he when he talks to Grandpa on the phone, Grandpa's calling from his truck because he was a truck driver back then too. So yeah, that one kind of kills me because he nails this kid's voice. And Ken's also a barber, so he cuts people's hair. He would cut his grandchild's hair.
Tell me, how much of the time would there be a gradual appreciation for what the students were doing when they were incarcerated, as far as the writing went? I mean, how often would you see somebody change a little bit?
Oh man, I saw people change all the time, you know, and it was, yeah, sure, it was gradual, and it was a whole, you know, a lot of different things that would happen that would help change them. You know, I like to think that this workshop was one part of that, you know, but I would see people who didn't want to share their work, who didn't really want to write, blossom. You know, they would be writing. They would write so much that, you know, I'd have so much to type up from them, and then, you know, they'd be the first one to stand up and read. So I saw that change, which was always, you know, hugely gratifying. And, you know, I saw people change. There was a guy, he's in here, CeeLo. Man, tough guy. He was like of all the guys that I met in there, he was the guy, like, if you first meet him, you'd be like, oh God, this guy's scary.
Oh, wow. Just
very intense. He wasn't even a big guy. He was a little guy, but he had the teardrop tattoo and the whole thing. And he's just this tough dude. Felipe Colon was his name. And through this workshop and the theater workshop that Ken mentions in his bio, he became, you know, so interested in writing and you know, writing poetry and stories and also plays. He wrote plays. And he said, you know, when I get out of here in 17 years, and this was a while ago, so he's getting closer, I'm going to work with kids doing this kind of thing, doing theater and doing creative writing.
Wow.
Because if I had this when I was, you know, 14, 15 years old and getting into trouble, I might not be in jail.
Maybe he realized that the facade of being a tough guy is an act in some ways.
Yeah, it's an act, and it's an act that, you know, in prison, in that environment, you have to keep up.
Yeah.
You know, but he could let it down a little bit when he came in here.
Tell me something that Anthony Dieris, who's the coordinator of our MFA program here, said about his experience teaching. He actually taught in the Boston jails, in the prisons. And he said that he kind of thought going into it, he was going to work with material that was more like you're presenting in this book. Mm-hmm. Kind of emotional stuff, reflective stuff, meditative type of writing, right? And what he got was a lot of the people in the writing classes were interested in how to fill out a job application.
Yeah.
Like, did you get that type of thing? Was you ever
not
asked
really
about that? No,
not really. You know, we were very clear as to, like, you know, how this works. It's like, okay, we're going to write about this. And they had help with some of that stuff at Garner. You know, there were GED classes, and there were, you know, a lot of counseling and stuff to help them with certain things. So they weren't interested in that kind of writing. at least when they came to this workshop, I'm sure they were very interested, outside of the workshop, wanting to do that kind of stuff.
You ever give any job references to these guys?
I wasn't allowed, It's like if guys would ask, not so much for job references, but for, like, okay, I'm coming up for parole. Can you write me a letter and stuff? And as a volunteer, that's like a no-no. I didn't even know that at first, but because I was like, oh yeah, I'll do that. It's like, nope, you can't do that. You can't have any kind of personal thing. But since I've been out of there, and particularly getting in touch with people for the book, I've written a whole bunch of those kinds of letters.
Good for you, because those people have no other person that has a relationship with that any employer could reference. So good for you for getting involved in that way.
Yeah, it's been it's been interesting. It gives me a lot of hope, but it's also depressing because some of these guys, it doesn't work. They don't get out.
It's amazing. We talk often about creative writers, and this will be the third person to be on the show to actually get a movie made out of his own book. But what I find most interesting is that we're not here to talk about that, which is really interesting.
Fine with me.
We spend so much of, and this is not to knock anybody else, but we spend so much of those other shows talking about what books that certain writers have that could be movies. Sometimes we'll talk for a half hour about, if you got Dennis Leary to, to back the movie, it would be the right thing.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me is you seem like you are an accomplished writer in that way, and you figured out that there's so much greater good that you could do through the art form and through the medium of writing. It seems like this is more your focus,
Well, certainly lately it has been, and it's been the most satisfying on that level of writing, of professional level. Much more so than writing the novels that I wrote or having the movie made, all of which is great.
It's cool. I'm sure.
I love it and everything. It doesn't hit me the way that this work hits me.
No, it's an interesting thing because I'm definitely not on your level, but even recently I was invited to go speak at Fordham University to some sports writing students, and one of the students had just a fantastic idea, absolutely fantastic idea, and I remember saying to myself, if this kid continues to do this, he'll probably go far.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, he emailed me afterwards, and he asked me if I would help him with his idea and take a look at what he comes up with, and it's a gratifying thing to be involved with that with anyone.
I'm sure a mentor,
right? And I'm sure, and even more so with people who really don't have access to that type of support, in the creative process.
Sure.
Really, really interesting. But before we go, humor me a little bit though. Did you have those years where you were, to get a novel published, especially the one that becomes a movie, did you have those years where you were very focused on your own writing, or were you always kind of a guy who did it on the side from something?
No, I was pretty focused on it. I mean, there's always, there was other stuff was on the side really for me.
Yeah.
The money earning stuff and the teaching and everything. And the writing has always been more, on the front burner.
Right.
And it's still that way for me. It's more important to me than anything else. I mean, this is in its own category. This work.
Right.
I was running a workshop, but I don't consider it teaching.
Right.
I never called myself a teacher. They would call me a teacher because I came in and I was the guy who supposedly knew everything. But I always avoided that term. I would say, okay, I'm a facilitator.
Right.
I'm
the conductor.
I'm leading this in the sense that, okay, I'm gonna, shape it for you and ask you questions and what have you. But I'm not really, a teacher in the usual sense.
Something you said to me a little earlier was that you said you also weren't a psychologist.
Yeah.
something like that. How often, I hate to say I felt this way at times, and I hate to say somebody will hear it, but how often, or do you feel as if that sometimes in these workshop settings, it kind of devolves from a writing thing into this weird emotional reflection thing at almost every period of the workshop, you know?
Yeah. Well, it definitely happens. Probably more so in this kind of workshop. Because these guys are coming in. First of all, they're coming in there. I mean, they're in prison, right? So it's like their lives are they just suck. So they're coming in, even though they look forward to it. It's like, okay, this is like a little, couple hours where I can kind of relax and I don't have that pressure or whatever. But they're carrying so much baggage with them, whether it's baggage from being in prison or baggage from whatever happened before prison. Stuff bubbles up, and I would have to kind of, corral them a little bit sometimes, because people would read stuff and guys would be like, oh yeah, I've been there, I know exactly what you're talking about. This exact same thing happened to me. And yada, and they would start telling stories, and I'd say, okay, let's talk about the writing, let's talk about the work, guys, and kind of get them back on track. I couldn't really help them psychologically. I think allowing them, or not even allowing them, giving them permission to write and share the work was, that was enough.
What about the kind of the short-term, long-term plan for you and the book? What's going on in the next couple of months, and what do you plan to do after this?
Well, I'm trying to put the word out there. This book exists. Try to get people to come to these readings, where I think they get their minds blown. By not by me, but by some of these guys who've been released, who show up and are there and talking about their experiences. And see what happens from there. The book, it's crazy out there. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
really hard to promote anything.
Yeah,
there's just so much going on. I mean, we met through social media, and I try to get it out there, but it's like there's so much stuff going on out there. So I'm just trying to get it. Opportunities come up. That's all. It's like every opportunity that comes up. Will you talk about this book, whether it's, with you here or reading, if I can do it, I will do it. Yeah. Just because I want this out there.
Do you plan on doing any more of your own writing? Do you see a novel in your future or maybe a nonfiction thing?
I got stuff going on. Nonfiction is hard for me. I mean, I've written, there's an essay in here. It's the introduction that I wrote. It was so hard for me to write.
Really?
Because I just, I find it very difficult to write about myself. My fiction is more about me than any nonfiction I could do, but it's hidden, It's like it's in a framework that's made up.
Right.
So it's much more in a way revealing. And I had to find a way to write this introduction. I wrote it 10 years ago, and
wow.
But way before this book, it was for an essay contest. I won the contest,
wow.
which was amazing. But it was because I found this way to write it, which was to basically remove myself from it. So that's really hard. I think about writing nonfiction, writing about my experiences in whether it's in prison or whatever, because it was so meaningful to me. But it's kind of like I lived it. It's like, why I don't want to spend a couple of years
looking
writing
over
about it.
Yeah. What's kind of interesting about it too is the capacity you have to put something like this together. I mean, the emails you had to send, the people, Facebook you probably had to track down, and
yeah.
I mean,
there's a lot of snail mail, because so many guys are still in prison. It's even though some of them can do texting and email now. I was doing all.
It's a very slow process.
All snail mail. You send something. It's like, oh, I just hope it gets to them.
Yeah. So, when excuse me, with a project like this, do you think that they would try and call for another book like this? I mean, if it does well enough. I mean, it seems like you are getting around, though.
I'm trying. They talked originally. I haven't heard lately. They talked about doing other books like this. This is Woodhull Press, the publisher. I think it depends kind of on how well the book does. But they were talking about doing other books like this, but maybe from different areas. Other people than myself say, I know a guy who's done this kind of work in Florida, and I'm sure he could probably do 5 books,
right?
Because he's been doing it. He did it way longer than me even, but these are all from a Connecticut prison. It's like, who knows? It could be Closer to Freedom, Florida edition or something like that.
Something that popped in my mind before I let you go here, Chris Belden. You've been really great. Thanks so much for visiting us on Public Reading Club. But we do talk about teaching writing in prison at the MFA program here for whatever reason, more than I thought we would. I thought it might have been something that 1 in every 50 writers you met tried or was interested in. But we found that there were a few interested writers here. Also had a gentleman named Bob Cowser who taught at some prisons for a while. He came down to speak. I can't think of the other gentleman's name. But do you ever think about, and they're so popular here at these colleges, you ever think about writing a sort of craft book for teaching at a prison? Something that would outline lesson plans and philosophy.
Well, it's funny. I mean, this introduction that I wrote, it's called "How to Teach Writing in Prison."
Oh, there you go.
And it's 1, 2, 3. It goes through the thing. It's not really a craft book. It's not written that way, but that's just the way that it's structured. That was my way in to writing about my experience. Yeah, I mean, it's occurred to me. I mean, there are some out there that Penn America has a book out, which is all about that.
Yeah.
They used to have it was like a little thin little book on how to do it.
Now it's probably like
now it's a huge book, it's like
size
this.
of a style book or something. Yeah.
It's gigantic now, and which is great that they have all this material. At the same time, it kind of lost that how-to vibe, and I think it is something that's kind of taken off. When I started doing this, it didn't seem like that many people were doing it, and I don't know if that was because of the way prisons were less open to it, but since I started doing it, I've heard so many stories of people in these past 10, 15 years doing this kind of work or trying to do this kind of work or wanting to do this kind of work. I think it's taken off. I think there's so much more in the air about the criminal justice system and the shortcomings and the things that are necessary, which goes way beyond creative writing workshops, obviously. But, that kind of opportunity is one thing that can, really help people on the inside.
Chris, before we let you go, I'm going to ask you one more question. What's your writing advice? What's like your go-to piece of writing advice that you give anyone? It could be simple.
Don't listen to. We're not allowed to curse on here, but I'll call it the poop bird, which is that bird that sits on your shoulder and says, "You can't do that. You can't write that. Your mom will read this, or your friends will read this, or somebody will think you're crazy if you write that." That bird is always on our shoulders. Don't listen to that bird. In fact, strangle that bird. And I love animals.
Our guest here on WXCI 91.7 Public Reading Club is Chris Belden. He is the editor of Closer to Freedom, Poetry and Prose from Maximum Security Prisons. It is out right now from Woodhull Press. Chris, where can they get it?
They can get it wherever books are sold. You go to a bookstore, you could order it. You can go on Amazon. You can go to woodhullpress.com and find it.
Chris, thanks for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure.
It's a pleasure.
Public Reading Club is a production of WXCI 91.7 Danbury Radio, hosted by Matt Caputo and produced by Pat Frenette and Matt Caputo.